now recording the meeting.
Yes,
Okay.
showing up as recording. Good job, Tom.
Okay. Hope, do you want to lead off?
Sure. Laura, thank you so much for meeting with us and for all the great partnerships. And one of the things that we're trying to figure out is our approach as we start this. And as you know, we kind of held off because of all the DLI work that we're doing. And it occurred to me that since you guys came in after we had started that, and our beginning helped you, right, miss some of the potholes and figure out how to move straight ahead in a more straightforward manner, that maybe you could do the same for us on this, right? That you guys are already into this. And so helping us figure out, and Monica and Mary have been so gracious to agree to co-chair a task force, which we need to put together. And Goodnight has been so gracious in a meeting with her where I was asking for her advice on people you might talk with about potentially funding us, and explained that there was no way that we could ask our deans to do for no additional what UNC deans have been able to get additional with, right? Just like on the DLI. And she was gracious enough, bless her heart, to say that the Goodnight Foundation would be willing to consider a proposal. And so part of what we need to talk about is in line with thinking of our task force and figuring that out, because we need to flesh out the task force members and figure out exactly what we want them to do. But the other part too is before December, so sometime in the next month or 6 weeks or something, Denise is going to be busy helping us figure out what to submit to them for consideration. So part of what we wanted to talk to you about today was really to see if you could kind of walk us through what you did and how you did it, which will help us in the funding piece, but also, I mean, it really helps on both, because obviously to help figure out how to fund what we're doing, we need to know what we're doing, but also how that worked on the funding piece. And then any things that, kind of things that you wish you'd done differently, or things that, or you would say are the number 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 things that we have to do because that was so important, right?
Yeah.
So just a very simple 5-minute Zoom, I'm sure.
Just like that.
Just like that.
Well, I will say, I think just to start with, kind of the most important thing is to really, what we found is having faculty be involved. And so, having your task force, I think that's exactly where you need to be, because I think, anytime change happens, it can be just a shift in thinking. And, it's a lot easier, I think, when comes from your colleagues, professional folks that you work with, as opposed to kind of top down. So that is my greatest piece of advice there, is that you definitely want to have that involvement. For us, how we began was we actually had some residual funds kind of left over from some other literacy work that we had done. And so to get the framework created with our faculty, basically had an application process. Monica knows this because she helped read through the faculty applications. We sent out the nominations. I think we got about 22 applications, which was good. And so from there, we selected, really thinking intentionally about geography, about the types of institutions, making sure we had HBCUs, Research One, all of those pieces. And we, the committee selected the literacy fellows, and they began their work in August. We also asked kind of our reviewers. Monica was one. We had Lynn Vernon Fagans from Chapel Hill. And then I had Paula Crawford from DPI was kind of on that committee, because we wanted to make sure it was not the system office saying, here are the people that we're selecting. So we wanted it to be external. We basically, for the fall semester, we paid them $5,000 for each one of our literacy fellows to basically get the framework developed and also develop a self-assessment. And so it took several months. My job was to keep reminding, pushing, facilitating, just making sure that we kind of kept to a deadline. and a timeline that
Got that, Denise? The pushing, making sure, but just
Yeah.
checking to make sure you're hearing everything correctly. Okay. But now, so Laura, I want to be sure I'm understanding. So your literacy fellows, is that the same or different from your task force?
Well, the literacy fellows were our group that,
Okay. So you didn't, that
Yeah,
was
we-
essentially,
yeah,
that's what we're kind of referring to as the task force. Okay, I just want to make sure there weren't two different groups. So-
no, we kind of kept that group, and they, I basically structured out a timeline for them of kind of, here's some things that we need by this point. The expectation was to take resources that our committee, which Monica was on the selection committee for the fellows, what are some seminal pieces of science of reading research that we kind of wanted to have as a foundation ahead of time before we even engaged in the group. So they had those as a resource. We set up like a Google site for them so that all of their information could be together. And basically, first meeting, we're like, okay, here are the big buckets. Then they basically split up into subgroups. Kind of, Denise, you know this from working on DLI. Okay, this person and this person is going to work on phonemic awareness and come up with the sub-competencies there. So that was the work that they did to begin with. And then they came back together, and we had the opportunity to review, and there were healthy debates about what was what we should include, what we shouldn't include. And then, so once we kind of got the structure straight, from there, they spent time on the implementation guidance. So in the guidance, basically, these are resources, information about, assessment, looking at different ways that teacher educators might present information. That took a lot of time. It's a pretty extensive piece. You wouldn't necessarily have to start with that, but I think it's helpful, at least at the minimum, to have kind of the research basis for, whatever your framework is going to be, or whatever you choose to do. And then we split up again to compose all that, came back together, did review. We also had one group that also worked on the self-assessment, which basically took the sub-competencies and designed it such that the EPPs could do that kind of on their own based on the framework. I would say, if you do that, create it such that it is really easy to quantify, because the way it was structured for our folks, it was basically a big spreadsheet. They want to do different categories, but it's not easy to slice and dice. So I have a grad student who is digging through all of that. So if you can figure out a way to do it where it's real easy, so that way you can kind of see, if you choose to do that, where your institutions are in terms of their progress toward integrating the science of reading, that would be a tip that I would share with you.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Laura,
Go ahead, Denise. No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, so all this was in the fall semester,
Mhm.
the structure and the implementation pieces, and how many faculty members, how many fellows did you have?
We had 8, which for us was about half of our EPPs. We felt really good about the committee. Our goal was to try to get the structure in place by Thanksgiving. And so then I sent out just kind of the competencies and sub-competencies, not the implementation guidance, to all of our EPPs before the holidays, and basically gave them an early February deadline to give feedback. And so that was kind of the second piece that I would say is really crucial, is that folks have an opportunity to, make comments, make suggestions. Now, we got some really good suggestions, lots and lots and lots of feedback. Some folks were not so complimentary, but that's okay. Those were,
I can't imagine that ours would not be. I just don't understand.
yeah,
Monica,
just, Some folks felt really strongly about some things. You know, I'm a little concerned about their, just want to call them and say, are you okay? Because they were real interesting. But we did that purposefully. We kind of set up a survey kind of format for folks to put it in there. We got great information from our campuses. And so basically we took all of that back, and the fellows, even though they weren't getting paid in the spring, you know, we told them this was kind of a part of your whole contract. They went through that. We went it together and said, okay, this makes sense. You know, okay, we did this, this, and this. And all of that feedback was considered in the final product. And what we did when we sent the final product out is we created a memo that basically said, you said we needed to do X, Y, and Z, and this is what we did, so that way folks would know, you know, we took your information, we appreciate it, we value it, and it's been incorporated. So, you know, that I think took forever. It is arduous, but I think it's necessary, because then you kind of get all of that naysaying out of the way. And, you know, you honor people's willingness to share. When we finally released it, we had a webinar where we invited the EPPs to come. Our literacy fellows did a presentation, which basically walked people through the framework, the implementation guidance, and the self-study. And there was an opportunity to ask questions. And then from kind of after that kind of kickoff, I basically sent out to each campus information on the self-assessment, like here's where you can access, put your evidences, all of those pieces from there. So that was kind of the framework kind of development. And right now our folks have finished phase 1 of their self-study. They will do phase 2 by October 1st, although some will ask for extensions. And then they're to finish by December. And so as a part of the self-assessment, they are to create an action plan, which basically says, okay, we've analyzed our programs, we've looked at our courses, here's where we have things that are missing. You know, our action plan is, okay, we're going to do X, Y, and Z by this time to ensure that we're making sure that those are covered within our courses, all of those pieces. For some of our campuses, that was a pretty easy process. They're doing what they need to do. There were some tweaks here and there. For others, it's been a much more arduous process, because they're super small and there's usually 1 or 2 people who are in charge of everything. Monica, you're shaking your head. Yes.
Yeah, I think we understand that.
Yeah. And so for that, you know, what we're trying to do is provide some feedback to each campus, just about kind of the initial phase 1, because some folks, you know, it's something new. You know, they might not include, they forgot to put their evidences in there or their artifacts. They didn't quite follow directions, which happens. So that's kind of the feedback. We also, with the grad assistant, we're trying to summarize kind of what do we know across all of our institutions, but we have a lot less than you all do. So, you know, trying to think about that ahead of time, you know, if that's something you choose to do in terms of a self-assessment. But we also, as a part of that, kind of simultaneously, we employed Epic to pull data for us from our EPPs about foundations of reading. They pulled the EVOS scores for K2, 3, 5. They looked at teacher evaluation, principal evaluations, new teacher survey. And then we kind of distilled it down to some metrics where we have benchmarks for our system. It's an aggregate of, you know, like by 2026, we will have this percentage first time passing on foundations of reading. that was a separate kind of research process, but we were doing it at the same time. So when you're thinking about looking at this holistically, when you're thinking about your ask to the good nights, it might be to have someone help you with the data piece. We were able to provide each campus their data before they, kind of were working on that end of that phase one. So they had information about how their programs were doing. They had information about how everybody's programs were doing. We didn't make that, public, but this was because this was a part of an improvement process. I will say data that you should have access to is those pass rates. That you can get that from DPI. Same thing with the student achievement. The new teacher survey, we actually asked Epic to add literacy specific questions. And that survey goes out to all recent graduates, including those from the independent institutions. So that was first administered this spring, so you should have data there as well. So, I think it kind of depends on how deep you want to dig. For us, we were pretty much charged by our Board of Governors that you will have goals and you will have benchmarks. It's a little different, I think, in your situation because you don't have that cover. So, in thinking about kind of how do you monitor progress, I think that will be probably one of the more, it'll create some more opportunities for growth for you all, just to try to think about what that means, because you don't want people to do all this work and do all these changes, but then, nobody looks at it, and what gets monitored gets done. So, but how do you do that in a way, but understanding, faculty autonomy, institutional autonomy, all of those pieces. So,
right. And certainly for us, it's part of our advocacy role rather than a regulatory role.
right.
So our point is, if the state is saying that we're going to have this, how do we help you, right? How do we help you do what you need to do so that your program is still approved by the state to be able to do this? And so but there is, while we have some institutions certainly represented here that are far ahead on this, others we really don't know, and they may be farther ahead. And Monica, you may know more about how far ahead some of them are, but everybody, I mean, we celebrate our individuality and our differences and our culture and all these things, but that also means that when we're saying, and when the state says everybody needs to do this, that then we have to figure out how to help them, and you're not always quite sure where they're starting at some point. So sure. I have several questions, and I'll be glad to open it up to everybody else who may have some too. One is, there's always a fine line between, once we pull our folks together, and I certainly appreciate your not wanting to have the system choose. We don't choose among our institutions either. We might say, we want, here's what we want, and we want somebody from these areas and this diversity and all of this. And usually we come in with a first come, first serve, right? That you get it in and you represent that category, you're good. And we'll have to see whether we can do that for that. But the other question is, in terms of, obviously you said you sent them out to do their research and things like that. And the question I think would be for us is, do we start there, or do we start with something that's already been done, like the work that you have, and give them a starting point, which we would not expect people to say, oh yes. We would say, it'll be, how do we tweak it to make it work for us? And so the question is always, you don't want to stifle creativity by having them say, oh, I like that, but you also don't want them to do a lot of extra work that then they say, well, they already did this and found this out. Why didn't we get to benefit from that? So right. I think we'll have to think that one through a little bit, but I hope that that's available so that our folks can certainly benefit from the work that y'all found on all of that. Is that correct? That's
yeah, I think from our perspective, I think as long as there's kind of acknowledgement of the intellectual property, it's not like we're here all for the same purpose.
Exactly. And so
Children learn to
let's
read.
not recreate where the things have already been done. We certainly would, of course, acknowledge. And I think that's another great thing to be able to speak to the strength of the partnership, right?
Sure, sure.
Whether it's DLI or whether it's the science of reading or whatever, that we certainly want to share and help our colleagues benefit from work that's already been done. So that would be helpful to have.
I think, go ahead.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I think, you know, in terms of kind of starting with something, you know, the kind of the competencies and sub-competencies, I think are a pretty good set that your faculty probably more than likely would agree upon. So that might be a really good start. We basically told and shared with our institutions is that our expectation is that all of them would be incorporated into their programs, and that was the self-assessment is, okay, show us that you've done that. And we have these metrics to monitor that, but we basically said it's up to the campus how they choose to address those. You know,
that certainly will be the case for us, and it'll be the case not so much that we are telling them, but we're helping because the state is telling them, and so they're going to have to do it. The question is, what can we do to help them, and what can we do to benefit from the learning and understanding and knowledge that everybody has to make it as easy as possible for people without having all 31 having to recreate the wheel and figure it all out, right? I mean,
I think you know, what's there is not anything that would surprise any one of your literacy faculty. I think there'll be some extra research they may want to put in there. We tried to put some very, you know, seminal research that's kind of respected across the board. But there may be some pieces. You may have faculty who are involved in research that would certainly be good to incorporate. I think the implementation guidance is just that, it's guidance. It does have some really critical points in there about how to work with you know, exceptional children who speak other languages. I mean, there's a lot of really good information in there, but you may already have faculty who those things. And so, you know, it certainly is not exhaustive, I would say.
Okay. Well, let me stop there. And I have some other questions too, but let me stop and see, Monica, Denise, and Tom, what kinds of questions do you have for Laura?
You've hit on something that, and Laura, you were answering it, I think, on the competencies and sub-competencies. And this might be for you as well, Monica. Are there anything about those competencies or sub-competencies that would be harder for a small program to address than a large program?
You know, I don't think so. I think it's more about the structure of how you do those classes within your institutions. You know, I think, of course, those institutions that may have more classes in literacy, it makes it a little easier because you can go into more depth. But even though it's like 84 sub-competencies, many of them, when you teach them as a teacher educator, you do those at the same time. It's not, you know, you're like, okay, we're going to do this one, check it off, we're doing this one. There are a lot of pieces that you would do together. We also, you know, we want our students to have practicum experiences. And so how you structure those, that's another way that you're covering the content, is that, you know, you're going to go practice and do these things. But at the same time, we have to remember they're still new teachers. And so, you know, we wouldn't expect, you know, mastery of every single one, because some of those things you really have to get in your own classroom and experience. But I mean, to me, I think for the most part, all of our programs have at least 2 courses in literacy. Those that have more than that certainly are a little further along in terms of integration, because they can spread those out a little more. But, you know, we didn't want to get into, you have to have just 2, and we just didn't want to do that because everybody structures their program differently.
And then something that I know that in conversations with Susan Gates, a lot of the letters effort is going to be teaching teachers who are already out in the classroom. how much of this work needs to go on first with faculty who are in the EPP? And it probably differs from EPP to EPP.
It does. I think, you know, the letters effort that we have some of our faculty engaged in is a pilot for us. Our intention was to do an RFP to find a vendor to do professional development for faculty and candidates. But then the legislature actually named the vendor. And so we're like, well, I guess we need to do that. And so I'm agnostic about Voyager, Sopris, and letters. I mean, I think it's a good quality product, but it's not the end all be all. And so for us, it's more important that we focus on those sub-competencies in our ed prep programs and make sure that we do that well, because, you know, letters is $1,400 a person to be able to do that training, which is really, really expensive. And so the goal is, of course, if we get it right in the ed prep programs, then they won't need it as in-service teachers. The science of reading, you know, the alignment with the framework and letters, the faculty were really adamant about making sure that we had a language component being explicit. They also were really explicit in writing, because letters, that's kind of addressed, but not so much, but you teach reading and writing together at the same time in many cases. And so that probably would deviate from kind of the typical what you'd think about in letters. We did the coalition of the willing in terms of the letters training with faculty because it's a commitment. I mean, it is a major commitment. But we, you know, the faculty who are they actually kick off this week, you know, they want to know what their partnering clinical teachers are going to be also trained in. So, you know, it just, you know, it's like you want to know, it's like the devil you know or the devil you don't. It's like, I need to know kind of what this is about and what folks are getting. Do I anticipate that some of that will affect kind of how courses are taught within the EPPs? Probably. But, you know, I have faith in our EPPs because of the depth of this framework. You know, that they're going to be able to make sure that it gets incorporated. So
you're saying the letters training is following after all the other work you've done. That's just getting ready to start. Okay.
So that was a part of our, we did a proposal to the Goodnight and the Spangler Foundations. And it went through many iterations. You know, we've been charged by the Board of Governors to say, okay, you need to do a professional development opportunity, figure out something. Well, that was the route we took, but then the legislature decided, oh, okay, well, we're going to do this for all these. And, you know, so our project basically we call it the Literacy Innovation Leaders Initiative. We have 5 of our EPPs who are getting funding for their redesign. So they're doing innovations off of the literacy framework within their EPPs to do the redesign work, because we felt like, you know, that this is an opportunity to have them dig deep into their curriculum based off of the framework. The faculty who are involved in those 5 campuses are getting letters training. A really small sample of teacher candidates are getting the letters training as well. We've aligned it with the first cohort of those in-service teachers that are going to be trained in those first cohort counties. So theoretically, you would have a faculty member who is working on this work. You have a teacher candidate who is doing the letters training, and then you would have an in-service teacher where they would do their clinical experiences with, who would also have it. So our goal is to study that as a part of research. And so we only picked 5 because we didn't have unlimited funds. And so that really is what we used our gift from them from. We wanted it not to be all about letters, because this was not all about letters. It was really about making sure that we had evidence-based practices within our ed prep programs. the letters is what we like to think of as complementary kind of supplement to that work. It'd be great if I could afford it for all of my faculty, but that would cost a whole lot of money. So.
Wow. Okay. So
We've been busy.
I know, I'm just thinking in terms of the funding for all this at that amount for the letters training. So was that in your initial request to Goodnight? And I know Spangler, obviously with Anna being on the board, is different. So we'll probably be focusing on the Goodnight Foundation for now, at least. Was that included in the initial ask? We're going to be meeting with Susan in the next week or two. And so I'm just trying to get a handle on our universe of requests.
Yeah. So for us in the initial proposal, we did not include letters by name. We basically said we were going to find a vendor that would be able to offer training to both faculty and in-service teachers. That was our beginning plan. But then the state decided, oh, we're going to do all the in-service teachers. So we're like, okay, well, DPI can do those and we'll focus on our locus of control. So I will say, working with Susan, she's going to be really adamant that as many faculty as you can to be trained in letters, and she will say letters. We wrote the proposal in the beginning with the understanding that letters probably would be one that would apply when we put out the RFP, just because of the work that they do.
Well, I think now that teachers are being trained in that, we won't even go there. We'll just say letters, because if that's what teachers are being trained in, that's what we would want to do, right?
Yeah. So I think, what we also did, which I think is important, especially when you're thinking about faculty and your ask, is that we are, as a part of that pilot, the faculty who are being trained, we're giving them a stipend each year because it's their time. I mean, this is like a 2-year commitment. They have 4 face-to-face days per year. You can do all the training online, but still there's you have to have seat time for a 6-hour day. Faculty, I mean, that's a lot to ask of a faculty member.
Yes.
When we did our proposal, we were like, well, you want people to do this and you want them to take it seriously. So we need to honor their time with a stipend. So, I think that is probably pretty critical, just because of, faculty are really busy.
So I think it would be important, just because our teacher educators, I think we say all the time that our EPPs between UNC and NCICU are the best examples of partners, bar none, right? Because we all talk about our partnerships, but we say that the EPPs have been doing it for years through NCACTI and individually and locally and all of that. So I think it would be important for us to do something similar in remuneration for our folks. So for our fellows or task force members or whatever we call it, you were saying that yours was about $5,000, right?
Right. And that was not a part of our gift from the Goodnight to the Spanglers. We had some leftover funds.
It will be a part of our request. So,
I think it would be good.
But I think trying to keep them somewhat on the same keel in terms of amounts, just so when they talk to each other, it doesn't end up, what do you mean you got that? We only got fill in the blank. And so then also an amount for the teacher educators and also for teacher education students. Did you say you had some of them? Did they all get some funding?
Yes. So for the faculty, we did $1,000 a year.
So 2 years, 2,000.
2 years, $2,000 a pop. Okay. I wanted to estimate how many faculty members we thought we might have. And that's a little tricky to kind of know how many that would be. But I think our number is about, we have the 5 campuses that will be doing their training because they're kind of required as a part of the pilot to do the letters training. So you're going to get these redesign dollars. You have to participate in the training, but you're still going to get a stipend. Then we open up some slots to the rest of our EPPs, the other 10 EPPs. So each EPP has between 3 and 5 folks that are a part of it. So I think our number's around 85.
That's a huge amount of time for faculty when we have EPPs that have 4 people in their whole program.
Yes, so that's kind of something you have to think about too. We didn't make it that folks had to do it, but we really felt like it, at least having somebody at each institution to have some experience with it would make the most sense.
Absolutely. No, I think the more the better if they can, one, take the time to do it and still be able to teach and do what they need to do for that. But just thinking too, in terms of asking for that support.
Yeah.
So those were 2 big components, right? Those stipends. And
Yes,
then did you also ask for them? Did they cover the consulting work that was done by Epic?
Okay, good question. So for the teacher candidates, because I didn't want to forget that, they will get $500 a year.
Oh, okay.
And that's a that's a really small piece.
Yeah, but they don't usually get anything, right? So
Yeah.
hey.
Laura, and sorry, there's just 5 teacher candidates for the pilot programs, or are there more than that?
There are only 5 EPPs that are doing the redesign, we're calling literacy innovation leaders.
Right.
We're expanding the letters training because we wanted to try to at least get it to somebody in each of our institutions to start with, especially since now all of our LEAs are going to be doing that as well.
Right.
But for the students, I think we only have maybe about 100 across those 5 campuses that will be a part of that. So it's just like a really small number.
But that's 100 and they're each getting 500 for 2 years, or just the 1 year? Okay. So they're each getting $1,000. So that's,
Yeah.
And
I'm
Laura,
just doing the math.
I
who
know.
chose your 5? How did the 5 get chosen for the redesign?
Good question. So we did a couple of things. We looked at a couple of our campuses were really doing kind of in front of this work already. And so they were kind of our campuses that we felt like, okay, if we could give them some extra dollars, they could do some really innovative things. We evaluate that process, and then we can say, okay, this is kind of the best of the best. Let's share this with our other EPPs. So we looked at that, which were already those that were just like this close to like knocking it out of the park. We also looked at data, their first-time pass rates for foundations of reading. We tried to pick programs that had some room for growth there in terms of their pass rates. Some have more room for growth than others. Our spotlight campuses, they still have some work to do, but then we had some campuses whose first-time pass rates were pretty low. And so this was an opportunity for them to get really dig deep into this so that way part of that could improve. So let's see, where was I going with that? I can't remember.
How you chose them, and you were talking about
Chose them, yes. Okay.
some leading, some needing people.
Yeah. We also looked at geography because we wanted to make sure that we had, East, West, Piedmont covered. Because I'm sure just like your institutions, it's vastly different in the East as it is in the far West. And we really felt that was important. So we looked at that. We also looked at leadership within their College of Education and tried to really think about those campuses where we would have a dean who would support the work.
Laura, excuse me 1 second, guys. I've got a president calling. I need to step off for just a minute. So I'll be.
When we sent the invitation out to the Literacy Innovation Leader campuses, it went to the chancellor and the provost at those institutions because we wanted it to be something that campus leadership was going to support. And so for some of our campuses, we have some new deans who are really excited about the work. And so this was like a perfect opportunity for them to make their mark. We had others who had interim deans who were like, this is a lot for somebody who might not be there at the end of 2 years. So that was a part of the factor as well. We wanted to really make sure the size of institutions were accommodated. We wanted some small institutions, medium, larger institutions, just because it is different in how you do this work at a small institution as it is to like App State, a really big institution.
And Laura, I know you were going to get to it, but the question that Hope had about Epic and whether
Yeah.
yeah.
So Epic, annually we do teacher quality research work. And so for last year's teacher quality research, a portion of that work, which are basically some dollars that we have set aside for that work. They're recurring dollars that we get. Part of it was to engage Epic in doing this data analysis. Now, Epic is not cheap. They are not cheap. But for this particular initiative, I think depending on if you chose to use them, it would not be a big stretch for them to be able to pull some data for you on your programs, looking at kind of those common metrics. The metrics that we selected are all a part of the accountability model for EPPs anyway. We did that intentionally. But we wanted, when we set our goals for the institutions, to be a little more specific. For our benchmarks, of course, we want to have better first-time pass rates of foundations of reading, but we also saw huge disparities between teacher candidates of color. And so, it's trying to reduce that gap as well. So it was a little more than just, oh, we want 75% to pass on the first time.
Yeah.
I think it certainly would be something that you could negotiate with Epic. It depends on how narrow your project is. This work was a part of several projects that we engaged with them around teacher quality. They did some work for us on some of the other pieces like clinical practice and other things.
Okay. And it really just, I totally am asking this out of not knowing the answer. Does Friday Institute do something like this as well?
Yeah, Friday Institute would certainly be a good partner as well. They do this sort of thing. I think and you're kind of, in some ways, Epic has a lot of this data. They house it for the Department of Public Instruction. So access to it is a little bit easier. They do the EVOS analyses every year. But at the same time, the data I know y'all have a data agreement with the Department of Public Instruction. It's not data you wouldn't have access to anyway. It just kind of depends on how you want to approach it. But Friday Institute can certainly do that work.
Yeah, but the economy of scale might be easier with Epic.
Mainly because they've done it before. We just have conversations all the time because, Epic has a market on this work. And, sometimes you feel like you're a little over the barrel. Because, and which was part of the reason, in kind of doing these things, you have to figure out, okay, do I want to do an RFP for this, and that of course takes additional time, or do you want to select like an institute and say, okay, we're just going to contract you for this scope of work. But, I will say, just in terms of cost, and you've got a lot more institutions, but I would say, you're looking at probably $75K, just basic analyses.
Okay. And then this is really a question that you probably have some thoughts about, and then Monica, you would as well. It seems to me from the outside looking in that the work that you all have done on the competencies and subcompetencies, from the outside looking in, it's kind of a no-brainer to start there.
Mhm.
But Monica, do you think that if we started there, there would still be kind of a sales job of making sure people felt that it wasn't just being imposed upon them?
I think it's a little tricky. I do think it's a great starting point. Again, I think as long as people feel like they have an opportunity to provide that feedback, I think that would be most important there, because it sounds like, Laura, you guys started with like the pillars or the 5 big ideas from the National Reading Panel report, and then added the writing piece and a language piece. Is that correct? Were those the big?
Well, we have 8 because we have
Okay, 8.
concept to print, language, and then
Okay.
the big 5.
Okay.
We looked at the IES Foundation's documents. That was kind of like the basis for, and like, I would recommend if you have that, you know, for our framework, we basically said, okay, where does this line up with that particular work? Because that is certainly seminal research. You know, I think the Department of Public Instruction, their curriculum, I mean, so it's all, you know, that unifying piece I think would be really, really important. But I think if I took it back to EPPs today, would they have different feedback, things that they would change? Absolutely, they would. But I think, you know, it's a matter of making sure you're following the letter of the law, because you have to do that. But then, you know, is it, if your folks kind of looked at it, would they be like, well, you know, that maybe we would structure this differently, or maybe we would look at something, you know, in a different way. But I, you know, to be honest, I think those foundations documents, IES stuff, that's the best springboard. They do, I don't know if Monica, if you're aware, they do have a new piece that they just put out for educator preparation on the foundations documents. So that one, we didn't have that when we developed it, but that could be a really good, you know, kind of a balance piece, is that, well, here's this new research. And so it's not just we're, you know, being made to do something that another system has already done or worked on. But I'll send it to you so you can look at that. Make yourself a note to do that.
So okay, so Laura, so if you were leading this group, you know, we're behind you guys. Where would you suggest we start? What would you say? Obviously, we have to build a task force. And then what would you say next big steps would be? What would you do?
Yeah, I think first you have to kind of agree on like the big pillars. I call them buckets, but whatever you want to call them. And if you want to just, you know, stick with the magic 5 because that's what's in the legislation, then, you know, you could certainly do that. Then kind of once that's agreed upon, what we ask our folks to do is like, we put up a spreadsheet, we put the buckets, and then we said, okay, everybody on your own in this Google Doc, put down all of the things that you think are really, really important, you know, for this fluency or whatever. You might not have to do that step. You could put up things that already exist and say, okay, let's get your feedback. Do you think this is good? Do we really need this? Do we not? And then once you kind of, that piece, I think it takes a minute to talk through it with your committee. I would say I wouldn't get a huge number of people on your committee because it's just hard to get everybody corralled. I think you have to dedicate time. You know, basically I structured it so that we would be meeting at least once a month. And then kind of towards the end, we had to meet a little bit more frequently just because we had to get it done. But they also had what I called my honey-do list. It's like, okay, we would meet and say, okay, here's what you need to do before we meet next. And so everybody had kind of their pieces. So I think the more upfront you can structure how you want it to go, I think it just is better, you know, smoother to get started. You know, I think it's a balance between, part of our application process, Monica, you know this, but we basically said, you know, to do this work, you need to be able to believe in the science of reading and be open-minded and not, we didn't want folks who were going to argue about every single thing. Sometimes it's good to have naysayers in your group, but in this work, in the beginning, to get things structured, you save that for when you send it to the EPPs to vet, because you're going to get plenty of that.
And I think for us, because we are, essentially trying to catch up on this piece where we've been so focused on the other, that it really would have to be presented in such a way of, to do this, you have to be committed to help us figure out best practices for implementation. So we need to ask for that commitment ahead of time, because the state is telling us to do it. This is not a question. This is this is not, you may have an opinion, but you're either committed to helping us figure out how to help everybody do it, or just don't volunteer, right?
Yeah, and we kind of articulated what we thought the amount of time would be as a part of kind of that application process, and so that they would know, like, okay, this is gonna be, however many hours over the next semester. So, you don't want, and sometimes that scares people away, but that's a good thing, because if they're not able to do that, then, I will say all of the team members pulled their weight. And that was mainly because we were just really careful about making sure that we got folks who really were passionate about this work, wanted to do this work, and we're not, going to derail things. Now, that doesn't mean that you have your convergers and your divergers, and, but that was my role, is to converge everybody into the same piece.
Well, see, I think it would be helpful for us to be able to get our folks identified before we even know we have money.
Yeah.
Because I think we need that commitment, and then it's kind of icing on the cake that we're going to be able to help them have something to as a thank you, right? But I wouldn't want anybody to do it because of the money, and certainly we need the commitment there regardless, because we don't know if we're going to get the money. So okay, so that's helpful. What was the amount or that it costs, say, for the consultant? Because we'd have to figure out how we might want to think about that.
You mentioned 75,000.
Did you? Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. I had to miss that.
Yeah, and that was for us. That was not just literacy specific. We had engaged in teacher quality work with EPIC, and this was one component of that. But if and knowing what I know kind of about the data, I would say that $70,000 to $75,000 range to help pull the data and all that would be my guess in terms of like best estimate of what they might charge for that work.
Okay. And remind me now, it's a new teacher survey. I know for a while there were some surveys done for teachers out of the governor's office. Is this one done through DPI?
This one actually, and I'm not sure how this came to be, but we pay for the survey to be administered to
UNC pays for it?
The UNC system, okay. Which I find really interesting why DPI doesn't pay for it, because it's one of, but anyway, that's another battle for Laura to fight another day. But the good news is that it does include all EPPs. And so that survey, EPIC administers it every year to the recent graduates from our ed prep programs across the state, independent and public.
And to whom do they report that data?
It goes to the Department of Public Instruction. It's a part of the accountability model. But this year, because we pay for it, we said, hey, we're doing this literacy work. We really think it would be a good idea to add some of these literacy questions about how candidates feel about how well they were prepared at their ed prep program on phonics, phonemic awareness, all of those pieces. So that the first iteration of that went out this past spring. And so there's data for everybody there.
But they're at EPIC or they're at DPI?
Well, EPIC pulls it, but they send it to DPI. Now,
the DPI has the repository. Okay.
So it's not something that you wouldn't be able to access. Now, this was the first time. And so part of the thought is that we'll learn over time what it looks like, but you by institution. So it's not something that you wouldn't ask for anyway. Now, I've asked DPI to be putting these things on the EPP dashboard because this needs to be available for everybody. We shouldn't have to be, paying Epic for every time we need something, the information. I mean, this has already been done. So we'll see if they'll add it or not.
Okay, but we should be able to get data from there.
You should.
That you mentioned a little earlier, at one phase, your folks doing something by December, and what you were just saying about Epic makes me wonder, there's something in the Senate budget that's not in the House budget. It's a study that the UNC system would choose a vendor, and then DPI and we and community colleges would report to them. Is that kind of the same thing?
That is not a part of my realm, but my guess would be that would probably be a good summary of possibility. But that's not something I don't know that it's just directly related to kind of this work that we've done previously. But I do think it is not out of the realm of possibility. Okay, the legislator said everybody has to do this. Well, guess what? They're going to monitor that. And so the next step to that would be, okay, we're now going to engage in this work to see if y'all have done what you said you were going to do. So, that may be it. Maybe it'll.
Well, I just had not appreciated until this conversation, that Epic would be doing it on a UNC dime, but doing it for DPI, and that just kind of crystallized for me why it might read that way. When I'm thinking among the things that you and I work on maybe in the future, it's for DPI's dime to be paying for some of this stuff.
Yeah,
It's also especially challenging when the State Board of Education has the constitutional responsibility for approving EPPs, and yet it's supposed to send information as we would to the Board of Governors. That's very strange. That's not a great precedent, I have to say.
well, part of the work that we are kind of doing as well is like we're revisiting our dashboards because what DPI has put out there does not give us the granularity that our EPPs are asking for. When they have to do their reporting and all of that, it's just not, but to give them credit, they're a pretty small staff. They're not funded in a way that really is appropriate for the amount of EPPs that we have. And the data, it's clunky. It's just really, really clunky. And it doesn't,
Have the Board of Governors engage the consultant to evaluate science of reading in both sectors, and something that the State Board of Ed is responsible for. It's just really weird. From when we were looking at that, we were going, what in the world? But now that you said Epic has done all of your stuff, that actually makes a lot more sense politically to understand what they're up to.
but I would say for that, the vendor, I think they would not pick Epic as the vendor for both.
Really?
I think it would probably be, I won't say someone more impartial because that doesn't mean they're not impartial, but not necessarily North Carolina based would be my guess.
Well, it's just interesting. I mean, first of all, the work y'all have done has just been incredibly extensive. And Denise, I'm so glad that you agreed to do this for free, Man, I'm starting to think, Denise, this is like, this is a big project, but the other thing is just, and Laura, you and I have had this conversation about a lot of things. It's just DPI, I know they always love to say, oh, we're just a messenger, we don't have that large a staff. But if they're going to regulate EPPs, they need to stop making that excuse.
Well, if they're going to provide the data to the state board to regulate EPPs, right? I mean, that's the state board depends on them. And so, so that's a little bit of a question. That's interesting about the Epic thing. I will just tell you, Laura, and I probably shouldn't say this since it's being recorded, but I'll say it anyway.
I can always stop.
No, that's even worse. It'll be like the 7-minute gap or something, right? We had a real issue when they were doing the longitudinal data system, when Epic was doing that. And we said some things that essentially got left out completely and ignored completely. So as if they were never said, some questions and concerns we had that were completely overlooked. And it's like, everybody wants this. And so I was stuck at the education cabinet meeting having to say, with clearly the bulldozer coming down the road there, do I want to lie in front and be run over? Or do I just want to make a couple of comments? And so I just made a couple of comments, but they completely ignored everything. So I personally would not trust them to do anything for us. I have to say, after that experience, it was so negative and so the arrogance and the way that we were brought into it was that they had done all this work on longitudinal data systems. So when they came to interview me, I said, well, I've been involved in this since the beginning. Tell me where you've done this work. And it's, well, we're collecting some of that data now. So it's completely with not true. I mean, I don't know how else to say that they had done that, and then to ignore then our concerns about issues. So I hope it would be somebody, whoever's doing it and whoever is responsible for overseeing it. I have to say, personally, I would go into it if it were Epic with some real questions. So hopefully you're right, and it would be somebody else.
Hey, Hope, I think these two guys must have been joking about the 7-minute gap.
Is that your Nixon picture, Tom?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
That's
I
my
think,
dad and Richard Nixon laughing about. It's really a 20-minute gap.
well, I think, because I know where you're coming from, especially when the lab school started and they were involved. Was it just them? There were some questions. I think from this perspective, we were really explicit about what we wanted. And so, I think helped us in that realm, but is there other people that can do that work? Absolutely. I think in a lot of ways, I mean, it's great that you have somebody who understands the North Carolina context, Friday Institute, Epic, other folks, that's awesome. But sometimes when you're thinking about this more at a kind of a bigger, do you want somebody who's like, hardcore research, those kind of things that can dig into it a little deeper.
Especially when they're evaluating, because if the special provision says to evaluate that.
Yeah.
Right?
So we'll see. That's just my speculation. I don't know that that's the plan, but it would be my guess just because kind of the gravity of it, that it would likely, not be somebody from North Carolina. Would be.
That's helpful to know, actually.
So,
Yeah.
But I could be wrong.
It's also interesting, as long as it's been, the December 1st deadline. I mean, we probably won't have a budget until the middle of October, but
Yeah, that could be.
anyway. Denise,
And
Denise, did you have some questions?
I just have a question for Laura about when you were talking about getting information to your applicants about how much time you estimated this would take for folks. What were your estimations? Because I think that would be really helpful.
I don't remember off the top of my head, but I can look it up and I'll let you know. I can't, we had like a blurb. I will try to, yeah, I think it's in the call for applications that we had, but I'll send that to you so that you can, that little paragraph, so you can kind of see that part.
That would be really helpful, I think, for our planning purposes. Thank you.
And it depends on kind of what you want them to do, and the expectations. We probably asked for more than what we paid them for, just because the work was just really complex, and the self-assessment and all of those pieces. So, if I had to do it over again, I probably would have separated those two processes. But I only had enough money to cover the fall. And so that's why we did it all at one time.
So that's kind of leading me to my next question. When you say to separate them, do you mean like as in two different stipends, or have two different groups of people handling each portion?
You know, I think it could be either way. I mean, like kind of once you've developed like what you plan to use, I mean, you certainly could engage another group of faculty to say, okay, here it is. How would you assess this across your EPPs? I mean, you could certainly do that. You know, it was helpful, I think, to have the fellows involved. Now, would it have to be, you know, all of them? It could be a subset. I just think it was, you know, having familiarity with kind of what the pieces are. But I mean, it's not, I mean, it's just like any other evaluation and how you would structure that. It's just somebody, I think somebody who understands EPPs and how courses work would be super helpful. You know, I wouldn't necessarily engage, you know, kind of, you know, evaluator type faculty, but you could, I mean, you certainly could.
Well, I guess I just meant more like if those would be, or potentially could be two different like subcommittees. And so like one group of folks could kind of handle a lot of the structural pieces on the front end, and then a different group of folks. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking through how to.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly could. You know, I think it just depends on kind of your time frame, what you kind of what I do. I think if I could have had the funding, I would have preferred to kind of here's the framework and then take additional time to kind of let's think through this self-assessment, because we would want to have it so that it can be quantified and not for me like doing tallies to be able to kind of go through the pieces. So, you know, but we just didn't have the time to really kind of think all of that through. So.
Did you have another question, Denise, or?
No, I think
Okay. I have one, and that is, and I don't know if you, I apologize again for having it off, but in case you didn't talk about this, I think it would be hard for us to name a certain number of institutions and let them get paid for redesign. That's just hard in our ecosystem.
You have a lot, yeah,
to do that. And so I'm wondering whether it might be possible to ask for a certain amount to help every institution, right? That would be, rather than big money for a certain number of folks to do an entire redesign, but just to get a little bit of help for each campus that's going to have a variety of things that it needs to do. And many of our campuses obviously are still getting out of the hole from COVID. And so, and I don't know about you, but if I have one more advocacy group that comes in to tell me how that they want to meet with our folks to tell them how to spend all that money our colleges are getting, I may throw something, because I keep saying, well, we actually know how we're going to use it. Thank you for this great suggestion, and that so glad you've done all this conceptual work about how we can do it. But we are just trying to get out of the hole that we're in, and they just seem taken aback. But so I'm trying to figure out if they're going to be forced to do this, which I'm sure some of them will take it that way. Some of them will see it as an opportunity, and some of them will see it as, oh gosh, we have to do this. The newest thing from DPI and the state board is to give them a little bit of help, and thinking that might work better for us. I don't know. We'll have to see. But choosing a few who might get significant funds to do it when everybody has to do it, and obviously some much farther along, and some we're not sure if they're any farther along, right?
Well, and I think it's time more than anything. It's like if there's funding there so you can do some faculty release or whatever, that's great. Or, if you have some faculty working on it as an opportunity to pay them an extra stipend to do this extra work, that certainly could be a part of it as well.
Okay, that might be something that
my institutions, they're upset. Some are not real thrilled that they didn't get picked. But our thought is, this is kind of, we need to study this and making sure that we're thinking at first before we go try to
totally get it. And being in a system, I think it's just, you might get a little pushback, but it's so much easier to do that when you're in a system than when
Sure.
we are not a system.
Yeah,
For sure,
I get
we're
it.
not a regulatory system. And so it's a little different in trying to figure out the best way that we can provide incentive and advocacy and support and all of that. And it may be that we would ask for a certain amount per campus for EPP, and they could use it. It might be one person's stipend. It might be 2 or 3 people they use it for. I mean, but let our colleges decide the best use of that money. But trying to figure out how to give them something, because we know that, you know, our EPPs are also among the most starved financially among institutions, right? And that's hard too. So trying to ask them to do all of this without any help is a real challenge. Is there anything else, Laura? I know our time has got like 4 minutes left. So is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you got funding for that you would think is really important to do?
No, I think Susan's I will tell you, Susan will push you on getting all your faculty trained in letters. And she's going to want to know how many of those faculty are in your first meeting, just so be aware of that.
Oh, well, that's probably, I don't know. How many have you got, Monica?
No
So
idea.
I think if you have 0, I think our answer is already there.
Yeah, so she will push on that. I think in our experience with Susan, you know, she's very much a diverger on her thinking. And so I think if you can kind of go into that meeting with, okay, here's what we're thinking in this, you know, kind of X, Y, and Z, I think that will help you tremendously. Because if you open the door, you know, it gets, and that's because she just does this work all over everywhere and she gets real excited about it. But like, okay, we got to do this, you know, we need like narrow it down. You know, I think that's definitely would be my best piece of advice there.
We appreciate her offer to help because
Yeah.
she's actually working overseas or something. I thought she was overseas on a trip or something, but then she said, no, she's working overseas at the moment. I don't know.
Yeah,
where
they
that
have
is.
a villa. She has a villa in Italy, I believe it is, where she works for part of the year.
Okay, so this is not like a SACS installation somewhere where she's working. It is.
You know,
I
don't
am
know,
overseas and
but
I am working.
She's mentioned
Okay.
her villa before. And so my villa happens to be here at the lovely mid-century building in the UNC system offices. That's my villa. But yeah, I
We
think
have our old Victorian house and we're thrilled to have it. But
you just have to kind of narrow it, but she's going to ask you some, you know, what about your principal preparation programs and, you know, all of those kind of things. And I think because that'll come up too. You just kind of have to keep that reined in as much as possible. I mean, unless she's going to give you an unlimited dollars, which probably is.
Goodnight Foundation does not normally do. We know, right? So we have to do that. But she is, I think, nice of her to offer. And she said she'd helped, you know, with this and with y'all. And so she wanted to help with us, offer to help us as well.
Yeah.
And which we said, thank you very much. That would be great.
Well, I will send you those things that I said that I would, so that you have that information. And if you think of something else, you know, don't hesitate to reach out. Glad to share. Poor Denise is dragging us along, or at least she did while we were doing this work for the DLI stuff, because that is not my wheelhouse. Literacy, I'm your girl, but that is just not me. So.
Well, we can.
You can run, but you can't hide from you, Laura. That's it. You're stuck with me, I think. So.
Well, it's a good place to be stuck.
Great partnership. I mean, it really does help that we're all working on the same thing and toward the same goal. Monica, I feel like we talked and didn't give you necessarily enough time. Do you have a last question or are you good?
I think I'm good. Laura, I appreciate your willingness to share everything. It sounds like you guys have done so much work, and you've done amazing things, and we're just so appreciative. So we're going to learn from you guys, and expect emails from me because I'm going to have a lot of questions.
Well, and the
Absolutely.
great thing, Monica, we appreciate your co-chairing this because obviously you've been very involved in helping UNC too. So you'll have that piece. Denise has the piece of having run the DLI. She knows how to get people working together and pushing toward things and all of that. So, and then Tom and I are kind of going, yes, great job. So happy to do that part for sure. And we'll certainly do our part.
Laura's sitting there thinking, and Tom knows how to lower the boom on people.
Well, we hope we
You
won't.
know what? We all have our roles.
That's
We
right.
all have our
Well,
roles.
and Laura, I did call Eric after our meeting last Friday and congratulated him on his skillful handling of that meeting. He was really good.
Well, you have a dream team here on this work, and if we can help, I'm glad to do that. You know, this is, I think, for me, you know, this is 29 years I'm in now, and this is like the first time where like everybody's just talking about the same thing and has the same focus, which I think is rare. I'm certainly excited about this work and glad to assist if I can.
Great. Thanks so much. And thanks for taking time with us today. We really
Sure thing.
appreciate it.
All right, y'all take care.
Thanks,
see you.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.